welcome to this episode of Chain Conversations. My name is Laura McQueen and I'm the MD here at Leaders. This season is part of a programme called the Leaders Meet Diversity series, which we've been running in partnership with Facebook for a couple of years now. Chain Conversation brings together leaders from a variety of backgrounds across professional sport to share their personal stories, to reflect on their own career journeys, pinpointing some peaks and troughs, some helps and hindrances along the way to share with you. The premise is simple, really. Person A picks person B to interview, person B picks person C to interview, and so on and so on. So over the course of the coming months, you'll really get exposed to quite a lot of independent personal journeys throughout the sports industry. The aim is to inspire you, to energise you, and to showcase why diverse thinking and diverse opportunity makes for a better business across sport and beyond. I really hope you enjoy it and speak to you soon.
Welcome everyone to the next episode of the Chain Conversation series. My name is Maggie Murphy. I am the CEO of Lewes Football Club, and I'm joined by Lungi Macebo, who is the Chief Operating Officer for Birmingham City, having joined in early 2019. This follows a longer stint at Charlton Athletic, and you're also Director of Women in Football, the organisation that's trying to push and promote women working in all aspects of the game. It's going to be hard for me to not see this as a personal mentoring exercise, Lungi, but I'll try and cover a lot of topics for everyone else's benefit as well. You're obviously at the top of your game, but what I'm really curious to find out is, did you imagine yourself to have this role when you were a teenager? Could you ever imagine being in the role that you've got right now?
Maggie, thank you for having me, first of all. And I think I'm not sure I am at the top of my game just yet, but I'm certainly on my way there. In terms of where I'd imagined I'd be as a teenager, definitely not in football. I had no idea the amount of jobs that happen in football. Thankfully, thanks to my dad, I've always been a football supporter. But actually, in terms of what happens in the back, aside from those men on the pitch who are obviously playing football, no idea whatsoever. Didn't even have an idea that women played football, which I'm sure is something we'll get onto later. I always wanted to be a solicitor growing up. I don't know why, but that was always where I wanted to be. So definitely not. This isn't something I ever saw myself doing.
So how did you make that first entrance into the world of football? What was it? And obviously you must love the game, having been a fan, but what made you take that leap, or how did it come about?
It was actually by chance. It's not something I went looking for. And it was actually supposed to be something I did just for 6 months. It was stopgap for me, which sounds really, really awful. But I'd basically graduated. I'd started a graduate scheme in the city, which I absolutely hated. It was within retail banking. And I basically left and I was going to go and pursue my master's. But in the meantime, with Charlton Athletic being local to where I was living, I had a temporary role offered to me there. So I took that up and I haven't looked back. That was back in 2012. So it's definitely something I've enjoyed in terms of learning more and more, especially in my early days, just about what actually happens behind the scenes. And I think in terms of traditional work, you can have that within your 9 to 5, doing those things on a day-to-day basis, but actually you're working towards something at the end of the week or in the middle of the week in terms of match day, and actually just seeing that come to fruition is really, really great. So I can't see myself working anywhere else, I'll be honest.
It's interesting because you obviously made an impact pretty quickly. You were getting these regular promotions and slightly, a lot more responsibility in your day-to-day. What do you think was the reason behind that? What particular strengths do you have that you applied to those roles?
I actually think I've got a problem with saying no. But I definitely think it was my curiosity and just wanting to learn a little bit more. But I think actually being posed with the challenge of not having anybody else there to do something, and actually you'll find with a lot of traditional football clubs, there isn't a lot of staff there. Clubs might be high profile, but actually in terms of a resource can be quite light. So it's easy enough to sort of pick up on things because I was willing, I was curious, but I think a lot of people around me had a lot of faith in me as well. And as I obviously went on and I proved myself, that just sort of happened naturally. I think the other challenges that I had that obviously led me to this at Charlton was around just that lack of staffing, but the need for people to pull in the same direction and actually picking up those other bits that needed picking up, in which I had capacity for. So I think that's probably what's led to where I am now. I think this is probably a lot more far removed as well from what I envisaged I'd be doing. Yeah.
I can completely identify with the lack of resources, human resources, and everyone having to pull up their sleeves. And I think that sometimes people imagine that football clubs are especially the big ones, you know, including Birmingham City, are full of cash and that, you know, nothing can be a problem. And actually on the inside, it's everyone needs to dig deep and work really, really hard. Is there anything that anything you've had to work on personally? I mean, I'm just wondering about whether you've had to learn to say no a little bit more. Is there anything that you've had to learn or to develop?
Believe it or not, I haven't actually learned how to say no yet. That's something I'm working on. It is still something I find really difficult, especially when I know I can actually do something and that I can probably do it really, really well. Because I think the other thing that annoys me, if I ask somebody else to do it and they don't do it well, it's not good. But I do need to learn how to say no and putting my faith in people a little bit more. But I think you mentioned there just in terms of digging in and obviously getting your hands dirty. I was trudging along at the training ground today in the grass, which, you know, is something you'd never do unless you were working at a football club. But actually, in terms of things that I've had to work on myself, is just how I approach people who maybe don't have the same standards as me, and that being just explaining to people my expectations. I think that learning has definitely come in the last 2 years with regards to my role. I obviously have to manage people who are older than me. I have to manage people who have certain technical skills. So your groundskeepers, your maintenance staff, your facility staff, you know, areas that I don't have the technical knowledge in. But actually, in terms of managing people, that's something that I am really good at. Something I've obviously had to develop over the years, but having those people trust in being able to come to me so that they are led by me is definitely something that's developed over the last couple of years.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. Also, just for me, in my new role as CEO, I'm definitely experiencing exactly what you're going through with suddenly overseeing people that have technical capacity that I just will never have. And that management is definitely something that I'll be developing, I guess. So I'll definitely be coming back to you. One thing that I've noticed, well, one thing that is pretty evident, I guess, is that football management and operations and governance is really pretty old-fashioned and set in its ways, especially if you think about the fact that, I mean, here at the club, you know, it's been here since 1885. So there's a lot of traditional viewpoints. I've heard you before talking about having to drag some of the more traditional elements out of the club, kicking and screaming, or pulling it into 21st century. What were you meaning by that, or what kinds of traditional points of views or ways of working were you thinking about when I've heard you talk about that before?
I've definitely experienced that at both clubs I've been at, Maggie, and it's around the people who are great and a part of the club in terms of being a part of the family, but have worked in these areas for a long, long time. So when you ask them to do something a little bit differently, you get the excuse of, well, I've always done it this way. We've always done it this way. You know, why do I need to change because it's always worked? But even just from thinking a little bit longer term rather than the season that's upon us, has been something that's quite challenging. Strategizing a little bit more, because I think football clubs are obviously results driven. It's a results driven business, which everybody understands. And ultimately it is about what happens on a Saturday afternoon or a Tuesday evening in terms of that result. But actually, when you look at your human resource in terms of how are you developing those people who are obviously going to take you into that next level, your facility, how are you developing your stadium, how are you developing your training ground, which is obviously going to take you to that next level. And then I think what football clubs do really well is the academies and how they're managing those areas. But even there, I've seen some really, really good head of academies or academy managers who are really modern in their take in terms of their continuous development for all their staff, including obviously their players as well. I rarely see that replicated on the business side of the football club. You'll find somebody who's maybe worked in the ticket office for 10, 20 years and has never had any personal development. So it's small things like that which really, really make a difference to your bottom line as well, ultimately, which is obviously really, really important. But I think there's just the rhetoric of we've always done it this way, so it should be this way, or this is football, you know, and football is just like any other business. But I think people take that for granted.
How do you choose when you'll try to softly work from the inside compared to when you put your foot down and drag something kicking and screaming through to the next? Where is the line for you? Is it how do you figure that out?
I think it depends on what it is, Maggie. Obviously, my strongest point is managing people and driving strategy and probably project management as well. And I think when I know I'm certain about something and I know I'm certain it's the right thing to do, I will absolutely put my foot down. In some instances, I will obviously be led by people who maybe have the better technical knowledge than I do, which is okay. But there are elements where I can actually challenge on that. And I think that's obviously a lot more straightforward to do internally. I think a lot of the challenges that we've still got within football are obviously with a lot of football clubs who maybe aren't as invested into as the clubs in the top two tiers. And I think that's probably where the biggest problem is for the industry, that you have got people in some instances who are volunteers, and actually it's really hard to make that change when you're not being paid for something. You're doing it for the love of what you've got there, and you're doing your best with what little you have. And I think just challenging that, the industry, I think, has a responsibility to do that. We're probably not doing enough of that. And I think if the last 18 months have taught us anything, is we need to see football clubs surviving rather than the spending that's been going on, which has started again now in terms of player trading and such. But I also think those lower league clubs treating football like an actual business, as opposed to just, you know, we're playing football and that's all there is, because you have to invest in your people. You've got to invest in the facility that you have, and ultimately that's good business.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, definitely from our side, you know, on the men's side, we're non-league. The women are obviously in the championship, but we have about 100 volunteers that operate across the club, right from being on the turnstiles on game days down to our groundsmen. So it's definitely something that managing volunteers can be tricky because you depend on them. And yet you're not able to provide any monetary incentive, but they're here because they love the game, they love the ground, they love the team, they love the club, and they've been here a lot longer than I've been here. So it's really interesting how to manage some of those interests. Have there been particular times or particular people, those very, very traditional people, have you learned how to deal with them a little bit better over the time that you've, well, in either role, whether at Charlton or at Birmingham?
I'd actually say I haven't come across too many of them, especially in terms of people who are maybe above me. Charlton, when I first started, had just appointed a new leadership team, which was great and actually made things easy for me in terms of picking things up, and obviously them having the trust in me as well. But I think other members of staff who maybe weren't so keen on sort of coming into the 21st century, probably a lot more challenging. So it's probably easier to deal with those people because I guess I had a lot more authority over them. Yeah. Similar to what we've got at Birmingham City, our board is fairly young. Our senior management team is fairly young. And then you've obviously got members of staff who are maybe a little bit older and are stuck a little bit in the dark times. And I think the easiest thing in terms of that is obviously bringing people along on that journey and actually addressing any of the issues or the challenges that they have in terms of getting to that modern era. But definitely not as much internally, thankfully.
But you've also talked a little bit about how in the past, about how you've arrived for a game and people have kind of done a double take because they're not expecting you to maybe look the way that you are when they see your job title on paper. How do you deal with those small but probably quite persistent annoyances in the way that people deal with you?
Yeah, I think, and yeah, unfortunately, I noticed it from the very first time it happened. But I think, and I don't know whether, obviously my name isn't English at all. So I don't know, maybe they're expecting a man. And then when they see a black woman turning up, it's probably like, oh, you know, that's definitely not what I expected. It's something I've learned to deal with in terms of just being ready, I guess, for being challenged. And I absolutely expect to be challenged because that's what the stewards are doing. That's their job. I'd expect my stewards here to challenge anybody who they think doesn't necessarily have the right to be there in terms of accreditation, either than they just haven't got the accreditation apart from anything else. So it's just about, you know, being polite and obliging to whatever it is that they need. And in all fairness, I haven't had that trouble, but it's just, I know, like, you know, I wonder what you're thinking in terms of the way you perceive me. But I also think when I have conversations with people, maybe when I've made it into the boardroom, because that's the first challenge, making it into the boardroom, and then when I'm actually in there and I'm you know, talking to people, I think they are surprised, but they don't necessarily ask. I have had a few people asking me how I've got my job, but I think I managed to nip that in the bud fairly early on.
I just find it fascinating because, yeah, those double takes, or once or twice I've had in the past me queuing up for coffee at a conference where someone's said, black 2 sugars please, to me when I was queuing up also to get the coffee, and having to, those little interactions, which at the beginning you're just a little bit embarrassed, both for yourself but also for them, but then it kind of can be a little bit persisting sometimes. I'm just switching track a little bit. You've been a director you've been on the board of Women in Football for a little while, a couple of years, I think, 2 or 3 years maybe.
Just over 3 years now, yeah.
Over 3 years. So, I mean, you already have a really a full plate with your existing job. What drives you to do that in your spare time, knowing that it's a bit of a shift? How do you do that, and what drives you to keep doing that?
I think to begin with, Maggie, it wasn't too bad in terms of the requirement around sort of time commitment. It's definitely grown in terms of us growing as an organisation. But I think what attracted to me in the first instance was pure admiration, actually, for the board that was there at the time, and the staff that were there, in terms of the work that they were doing. And actually it was something I wanted to be a part of, because it was something that I believed in. Their values aligned with my values, they still do, and actually just being part of that has been really, really great in that 3 years. We've achieved quite a lot. There's still a lot of work to do, unfortunately, and we always joke that, you know, hopefully women in football isn't always going to be needed. You know, we all know we've done a good job and we've achieved what we needed to achieve when it doesn't need to exist anymore. But that's probably definitely what drives me, giving back. My biggest involvement has been around developing women who are working within the industry. So that's definitely something that drives me and spurs me on in terms of giving back to young women, but women who have also worked in the industry for quite a long time, but have felt isolated because there's nobody else around. So I think that the time constraints are they're a thing, but I make time for it.
Yeah, it's incredible. And obviously women in football have grown so much and developed so much in those last 3 years.
Yeah.
And it must be quite, although you probably don't notice it while you're in the thick of it, it must be nice to be able to take stock every so often and go, yeah, okay, we're making progress here.
Absolutely. We've just finished our strategy for the next few years, and actually looking back at what we've done is absolutely incredible, especially looking back at the last 16 to 18 months where we've been in the pandemic and we've still been able to deliver what we've said we're delivering. Biggest part of that obviously being self-sustaining, and not necessarily having to rely on funding from Premier League, the FA, or anybody like that, but being able to be commercially viable. And the women we're reaching and the growth in those membership numbers has been absolutely great, but we've still got a fair amount of work to do, I think, in terms of changing the industry and changing perceptions.
Let's we're obviously seeing huge amounts of progress in terms of visibility of women in football and the work there to normalise and support women. I'm just wondering though, I wonder whether on the other hand, we've seen a lot of racist abuse of players, especially on the men's side, but also on the women's side, most recently culminating in the men's Euro finals. Whilst we're seeing lots of progress on the women's side, it feels like on issues to do with racism, we're actually maybe going backwards, or things are surfacing a little bit. How optimistic are you that football has the capacity to actually address racism on the pitch?
Not very. And I've been asked about this probably since quite a bit, actually, since the last 2 years, just because it seems to have been a lot more prevalent for whatever reason. But I don't have much hope in terms of, I think, football itself being able to manage that. And I think the biggest reason for that is because it's not a football problem, it's a societal issue. And I think until society has taken it seriously in terms of actually either self-policing or actually just doing better in terms of those people who choose to do that, because I think the people who are doing it, especially inside the grounds, are people who obviously have group mentality and are acting in that sense because they think they're anonymous, and you see it with the social media abuse because they think they're not going to get caught. And I think what you've now seen is obviously police maybe taking it a little bit more seriously in terms of investigating, but then when it comes down to prosecution or the actual repercussions, you know, it's a slap on the wrist, which isn't enough. And I think if you're going to make an example of people, you really have to make an example of people. And I think unfortunately it's going to take some extreme measures for people actually to change their ways. I think just recently there were 3 youth players who have actually been released from their scholarships because they were privately, or so they thought, basically inciting racist abuse amongst each other about the players at the Euros. And it's unfortunate because potentially there you could have ruined your playing career. And I say potentially because I know for a fact that somebody somewhere in terms of a football club is going to pick those players up, just because, you know, it's not seen as a big deal. And I think that's part of it. And we speak about education. People aren't doing enough self-education. People aren't doing enough to sort of change their own behaviours, challenge their own behaviours, challenge their peers' behaviours. And I think football, unfortunately, it's probably a job too big. But I think in terms of what's currently happening, with the players obviously choosing to stick by taking the knee, which is really, really key. And at the back end of last season, I know there was a lot of rhetoric around it being an empty gesture and it being done and us being desensitized to it. But actually the fact that it's happening all the time and you're constantly complaining about it is actually saying a lot more than the gesture itself, probably. And actually just keeping that conversation at the front of people's minds is really, really key. And until some real changes are made, they have to be doing something, because I think as an industry we've probably let them down.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Also that point about a football club somewhere will pick up those 3 players, and that brings in that concept of values. A lot of clubs will talk about their principles and values, but then maybe make decisions that seem to go against them. So, you know, a principle is only a principle when it costs you. And so it'll be interesting to see how clubs will take on this mantle and actually do things which are really meaningful and substantial, and allow their players also to express themselves. And it's interesting as well what you said about this being a cultural thing. So it's not, from your point of view, it's not just for the clubs, it's not just for the police to do, it's kind of a whole society thing. It's societal,
Maggie. And I think you've got a section of society in football which largely is a large one, but actually there's a lot of people it doesn't touch. And if it's not acceptable out in the streets, it obviously shouldn't be acceptable inside a stand. But actually, if you, when you're inside a ground, are doing that, and you expect to maybe do that when you're out in the streets, you know, it's just not acceptable. But I do think it's a bigger problem than just for football.
Switching it up then, if you had £1 million, where would you be investing that tomorrow?
I mean, if somebody gave me that today, it would absolutely be women's football. It's still the fastest growing sport. It's obviously had an unfortunate pause in that, just in terms of the pandemic. But I think in terms of a return, you've absolutely got it there. And without a shadow of a doubt, that would be where I'd be putting that in. And I think grassroots still needs a lot of attention. I think we've obviously been talking about the programme probably for the last decade quite a bit. Has it got the level of investment it needs? No, absolutely not. But I think what we haven't got, and maybe we've seen it in the last global tournaments, is the talent actually coming through in terms of women's players. I think just in terms of have rebuilt the team this year for Birmingham City, that's been quite challenging in terms of just that talent pool being quite shallow, really shallow. And I think it's because girls naturally fall out of sport when they hit puberty. And I think there has to be a way to change that and change those perceptions, but also develop players who are going to be world beating, you know. And I know we think we are, because we think we've got the best league in the world. But that's yet to be challenged if we can't compete in the Champions League final, if we can't compete at the Olympics, if we can't compete at the Euros next year, if we can't compete at the World Cup, and we're falling short in terms of quarterfinals or semis.
And then just to go full circle and start and end where we started, what piece of advice would you give your 14-year-old self that didn't think there was a place in football for somebody like you?
I'd probably say to her, check and challenge, do your due diligence, and I think maybe don't be so trusting of people. And I say that's obviously in terms of professional setting, and I think accountability is a big thing for me. But I think like not enough people basically take that seriously. And I think you can put your trust in someone, but actually when it's time to actually hold themselves accountable, they're not wanting. But yeah, I definitely think doing your due in anything that you do, I'd say that would probably should look at me and think, what are you going on about? But I think the penny would drop eventually.
Brilliant. Lungi, it's been an absolute delight for me to interview you. I've got loads of things I want to follow up on and ask for advice on. Let's hope that can happen. But thank you again for joining the Chain Conversation series with leaders.
Thanks, Maggie.